With the highest of spooky holidays quickly approaching, let's pick up where we left off with part 2 of our look back at the history of the Halloween franchise. This is Nerdist Now. Halloween H2O, 20 years later. With The Curse of Michael Myers finishing out the Thorn trilogy and the 20th anniversary of the franchise quickly approaching, the decision was made to do something special. Halloween H2O, 20 years later, is the next entry in the series' Choose Your Own Adventure timeline, which serves as a sequel to the original two films while completely ignoring the events of the Thorn trilogy. In H2O, Jamie Lee Curtis returns as Laurie Strode, now living under a fake identity as Carrie Tate. She is also the mother of a teenage son, John, played by Josh Hartnett. She now works as the headmistress of a private boarding school where her son attends, and is still dealing with the trauma she experienced as a teenager, with a strong paranoia around Halloween, much to her son's annoyance. There's not really an explanation for how Michael survived the events of Part 2 or where he had been all these years, other than a side character offhandedly remarking that they never found his body, which makes it seem more like this film is a direct sequel to the original, with only the revelation of Laurie being established as Michael's sister being carried over from the continuity of Halloween 2. It's hinted that maybe it has something to do with Josh Hartnett being about the age Laurie was when Michael came after her, but mostly he just sort of shows up 20 years later because that's when the movie takes place. The film opens with Michael stealing the file on Laurie from the home of the now deceased Dr. Loomis, where he runs into and murders Loomis's former assistant Marion from the original movie, who had been taking care of Loomis until his death. Also Joseph Gordon-Levitt for some reason. Back at the ranch, Laurie refuses to let her son go on a class trip to Yosemite, so he and his friends end up stuck behind at the school when Michael arrives and hijinks ensue. After picking off a few teenagers, the real show begins as Laurie and Michael go toe-to-toe in a final showdown. The third act alone honestly makes this film worth it, with Laurie standing her ground and giving Michael a taste of his own medicine. In fact, one of the original working titles for the film was actually The Revenge of Laurie Strode. Even after Michael is dead and being carted off in an ambulance, Laurie knows not to stop there. She steals the ambulance and drives off, just waiting for Michael to get back up. And when he does, she slams on the brakes, sends him flying through the windshield, and then rams into him, pinning him against a tree. There's a final interaction as Michael reaches out to his sister, and the two share an almost touching moment right before Laurie chops his head off with an axe. It's about as conclusive an ending as they come for a horror movie, and felt like an appropriate and satisfying bookend to wrap up the franchise. Halloween Resurrection. That is, until Halloween Resurrection. H2O was a massive hit, the first the franchise had really seen in a long time, so I guess it was inevitable that there would be a sequel. But how do you follow up something like H2O? By completely undermining the ending, of course. Halloween Resurrection starts off rewriting the final moments of H2O, which now sees Michael swapping places with a paramedic, putting him in his mask and crushing his windpipe so he can't speak. So when Laurie decapitated Michael at the end, it wasn't really him. This results in Laurie having a breakdown and winding up in a mental hospital where she is promptly killed off by Michael in the opening minutes of the film, completely ruining the previous movie in the process. The main plot of Resurrection involves a pair of internet reality show producers played by Busta Rhymes and Tyra Banks. They decide they want to make a new show set at the old Myers house and promptly gather a group of young contestants to scare the ever-loving out of. The home is rigged with cameras, and each of the contestants wear their own little headset cameras showing their POV throughout the experience. The whole thing plays as a sort of found footage hybrid, which is admittedly a unique concept, but ultimately the rest of the film is so poorly executed it really doesn't matter. Obviously, the real Michael shows up and starts picking them off one by one, with viewers thinking it's all part of the show. Busta Rhymes does some over-the-top karate moves and spouts off cheesy one-liners like, "Trick or treat, motherfucker." And in the end, Michael is electrocuted and left to burn to death, until he gets to the morgue and his eye pops open to tease a sequel that thankfully never happened. Halloween 2007. With Halloween Resurrection being bad, the decision was made to reboot the franchise with a remake. The responsibility for remaking such an iconic classic of subtle horror would fall onto none other than Robert Zombie. Fresh off the heels of his films House of a Thousand Corpses and The Devil's Rejects, Zombie was brought on to infuse some fresh life into the franchise and make Michael Myers scary again. While the film is technically considered a remake, Zombie's movie is largely an original work that primarily functions as a prequel that focuses on Michael's childhood and the build-up to his escape from Smith's Grove Sanitarium that we saw in the the original film. The final act retells the story of the original, but even then, Zombie offers his own spin on things and concludes with a shock ending that greatly diverges from the original, with Laurie shooting Michael point blank in the face. Some fans decry the idea that dedicating the majority of the runtime to showing Michael as a kid to explain why he is the way he is removes the mystery around what made him so scary in the first place, especially when that reason is that he comes from a trashy Rob Zombie cliche of a dysfunctional family and gets picked on by bullies. Others simply don't like Zombie's brand of horror in general and found it alienating to the style they loved from the originals. That said, after rewatching the film in preparation for this video, my first time in quite a while, I did find a newfound appreciation for what Rob Zombie brought to the table. And if that's your thing, it's hard not to love this unique spin on a classic, Halloween 2, 2009. While Rob Zombie's Halloween remake was controversial, his sequel is almost universally panned by critics and fans alike. Despite performing relatively well for the franchise at the box office, the film is a bit of a mess. Picking up after the events of the original, we see Michael somehow survive a point-blank gunshot to the face as he bursts back to life in the ambulance and makes his escape. We get a mini remake of the original Halloween 2 where Michael tracks Laurie back to the hospital, but that's just revealed to be a nightmare. Instead, we pick things up 1 year later with Laurie attempting to cope with the trauma she experienced while Michael has been roaming around and hiding without further incident. After beginning to have visions of his mother and younger self, Michael decides it's time to reunite with his sister and heads back to Haddonfield. What follows is typical Rob Zombie fare, with Michael hacking and slashing his way back to Laurie with plenty of over-the-top violence and profanity. The movie ends with Loomis, Laurie, and Michael in an abandoned shed surrounded by police. Michael kills Loomis, and then Laurie stabs Michael to death before walking out wearing his mask, setting her up as the new killer in the family. She winds up in a psych ward where she too begins seeing the same bizarre visions of their mother. The ending is controversial, but there's also an alternate ending that was included in the DVD release that was somehow even more so. In the director's cut, Michael busts through the shed with Loomis and removes his mask to say his one and only line. Die! The police then open fire on Michael, killing him. Laurie emerges from the shed, picks up Michael's knife, and approaches Loomis's body before police gun her down as well. Then Love Hurts plays while we see a vision of the ending with Laurie in the psych ward having a vision of her mother. So yeah, pick your poison, I guess. While Zombie quickly declined to return for another sequel, there were plans to move forward with a Halloween 3D being announced for release in 2010. However, the project never got off the ground, and in 2016, the rights would be acquired by Blumhouse, where the series would see yet another reimagining. Halloween 2018. Like H2O before it, David Gordon Green's Halloween set out to provide a fresh take on Laurie's story that disregards all the baggage of the sequels. Picking up now 40 years later, I guess H4O doesn't have the same ring to it, the film sees a timeline where Michael was recaptured after his killing spree in 1978 and has since been locked up back in Smith's Grove all these years. Unlike her H2O counterpart, this Laurie has spent years in full-on Sarah Connor mode. While H2O Laurie may have been a little overprotective of her teenage son, 2018 Laurie was such an excessive survivalist that her daughter had to be taken away from her by the state at the age of 12, and the two now have a troubled relationship. However, when Michael Myers, you guessed it, escapes in a prison transfer gone wrong, Laurie must protect her daughter Karen and granddaughter Allison when the killer returns to Haddonfield. The movie is a more grounded and somber examination of the effects these events had on Laurie's life, as well as the impact of generational trauma on a family. Things culminate back at Laurie's house, which she has fortified with all manner of traps and weapons. We get a final showdown with Laurie and Michael, which plays on many of the visuals of the original, now being inverted as Laurie becomes the predator and Michael the prey. Ultimately, it's Laurie's daughter who uses her training from childhood to shoot Michael, as all three women work to then trap him in the basement. They set the house on fire, where they let Michael burn with it as the trio hitch a ride on the back of a truck. As the house burns, however, the faint sounds of Michael's heavy breathing can be heard. Halloween Kills. And that brings us to the latest entry in the franchise, Halloween Kills. If you haven't seen the movie yet and want to avoid spoilers, now is the time to pause the video and come back after you've watched it. Still here? Let's dive in. Things start with a flashback to 1978, where we see a new version of what happened at the end of the original movie. In this version, we follow two young cops, one of whom is the young version of Officer Hawkins from the previous film. It's one of the best parts of the movie, as the filmmakers pretty effectively recreate the look and feel of that era, including a brief cameo of Dr. Loomis with the help of some very impressive practical makeup effects. We then jump back 40 years later, where we catch up with a group of legacy characters from the original movie: Lindsay Wallace, Marianne Chambers, Lonnie Elm, film, and Tommy Doyle, played this time by Anthony Michael Hall. Tommy gives a speech at the bar recounting their traumatic experience, and we cut to firefighters arriving at Laurie's home, where they inadvertently help Michael escape before being brutally slaughtered by him. While Michael escapes the house and begins murdering his way through Haddonfield, the Strodes arrive at the hospital where Laurie undergoes surgery. News quickly gets out that Michael is back in Haddonfield, and when it reaches the group at the bar, Tommy does what he's been waiting 40 years to do. After successfully rallying the town into an angry mob with an emphatic "evil dies tonight" catchphrase, they set out to find Michael Myers. Their vigilante mission goes about as well as you would expect. One group, including Lindsay and Marion, gets killed off almost right away with a fun nod to Season of the Witch. The mob then heads to the hospital where things spiral out of control, resulting in the death of another patient that apparently made their escape with Michael, who the mob mistake for the killer. Michael returns to his childhood home, which is now occupied by a couple simply known as Big John and Little John, played by Scott MacArthur and Michael McDonald. And I'm not gonna lie, I could have watched an entire movie with these two. Unfortunately, Michael arrives and quickly kills them off. Lonnie, his son Cameron, and Allison arrive at the house shortly after, and Michael kills Lonnie and Cameron in brutal fashion before turning his sights on Allison. Allison's mother Karen shows up just in time to stab Michael in the back and steal his mask. She uses it to lure him outside where Tommy and the mob are waiting to ambush him. Unfortunately, Michael Myers is Michael Myers, and even after taking a brutal beating, he turns the tables on the mob and kills them all. In a shocking twist, Michael then makes his way back up to his bedroom where Karen is looking out the window and kills her. The movie closes with Michael once more looking out his childhood window as Laurie looks out the window of the hospital, setting up their true final showdown to come. The film has already proven to be incredibly divisive among fans, with some either loving it and hailing it as one of the best of the series, and others ranking it among the very worst. While it certainly feels like a middle chapter with less of a clear narrative than its predecessor, if you want to see Michael Myers do what he does best, it's about as good of a Halloween movie as you can get. But that's the end of the road for now, until Halloween Ends debuts in October of 2022. Thanks for tuning in for our recap of the Halloween series. It's a long and twisty road of a franchise, but I guess you really can't kill the boogeyman. But tell us, what's your favorite Halloween movie? What did you think of Halloween Kills? Do you have any predictions for Halloween Ends? Let us know in the comments below, and for the spookiest and scariest in the world of pop culture, stay tuned to Nerdist.com. Have a happy and safe Nerdoween, everybody.